Right, everybody, drum roll, please. Today is the last beginner Java video in this series. The next videos that you're going to get are going to be associated with our intermediate Java lessons, which are going to deal with other topics like arrays and file access, and perhaps we'll get into graphics and graphical user interfaces and things like that. But for today, we've got to address one last topic. And if you recall, we had started talking about loops a couple videos ago, and loops are the way that we do repetition in programming. And I mentioned that in many programming languages like Java, there are two distinct ways of doing loops. One, which is called the counted loop, and that's where you say, please repeat this 3 times, or please repeat this 4 times. And we learned about that. In Java, it's called the for loop. And today we're going to be talking about a different kind of loop, which is when you don't necessarily know how many times you want to loop. It's not a question of counting, it's a question of conditions. Loop until your health is 0. Something like that. Loop until a person presses this button 3 times. Loop until, right? So you don't know how many loops it's going to run through, but at some point you know you want to stop the loop. And that's called a conditional loop. And so in Java, it turns out that when you look at conditional loops, there's 2 different types of loops. And I shouldn't really say they're different types of loops. They're really the same loop except for one small difference. And take a second to read this and see if you can tell the subtle difference here. So while some condition is true, loop, or loop while some condition is true. And the subtle difference here is a question of when you check whether you should loop. So when you check the continuing condition or the exit condition, however you want to think about it. When you look at this, the very first thing you do when you get to a loop is you check, should I be looping or not? Whereas in this other type of loop, the first thing that it does is it goes through the loop once, and then after it's gone through the loop once, then it will go and check, okay, should I loop again? And so this is a very subtle difference. The one on the left, it's possible that the code in the loop will never run because you're checking the condition first. If your health is 0 and you have a loop that says while health is greater than 0, do something, then you may not do any of the code inside there because the condition isn't met. This other type of loop, you are going to at least do what's inside the code once. Once you're going to do what's inside the loop, and then at the end it is going to run the check, and it may never loop again, but it will at least have looped once. And so that's a very subtle difference, and it turns out they're interchangeable. In my coding practice, I often will use the one on the left. I will rarely use the one on the right. Other people use them both equally. They do have names. So one of these, the one over here, is called a while loop, and the one on the right is called a do loop. And I'll show you what the code looks like in a second. But the other key thing I wanted to stress before we do that is this idea of a condition. So the way a while loop works, or a do loop works, is essentially the same as an if statement. In an if statement, you had a true or false, a Boolean statement. If lives is greater than 0, do something. A while loop, or a do loop, works the exact same way, except instead of having an if and some sort of Boolean condition, we are going to use a different keyword, which is going to tell Java that instead of making just one decision and then continuing, we actually want to keep making that decision over and over and over again. And so that's why I mentioned that this was often the easier loop to understand, because you're already familiar with making decisions using if statements. And a while loop is essentially an if statement that kind of repeats over and over again. So I'm going to show you some examples of this. So welcome back to NetBeans. Here I have a new program, a main method, and I've put in a little bit of starting code for us. We have a variable here which is going to represent, let's say, some sort of a score. And here I have a simple decision which is saying that if score is greater than 0. So do something if score is greater than 0. What we want to do is to use this program to introduce the concept of a while loop and what sorts of changes we need to make in order to do that. So first let's run this. So you can see what's going to happen is it's an if statement. Because the score is greater than 0, it is going to write keep going once. It is going to decrease. Remember, that's -1. It's going to decrease the score, and then the program is going to end. So what we want to do now is to change this so that it's going to keep looping as long as the score is greater than 0. And the key word that we need to change is the if. If I take this if and I replace it with the word while, now, instead of checking if score is greater than 0 once, it's going to keep checking it again and again and again and again. And as long as score continues to be greater than 0, remember it's not a stop condition, it's like a continue condition, then it's going to just keep going through that loop. So if I were to run this program again, what I've got is 100 times this is going to keep going. And so let's have a look. Just in case you need some extra convincing, let's actually throw in score inside here. And so now what you can see is that because I'm decreasing score every time, it is looping through here until this condition becomes false, which means it's going to start at 100 and it's going to go down to 1, and when it hits 0, it comes back up to the loop. It has broken the condition, so it's going to come down here and finish the program. So that is how you write a while loop. It looks identical to an if statement. It's just we're going to use this keyword while to indicate that we want to have that repetition occurring. Now remember what I said about it being possible that this will never execute at all. So if I had score starting off at 0 and I ran this code, nothing would get printed. The program would just run through and end. And that's because it does this check first. We did mention another possible loop, and that was called a do loop. And the do loop, it looks different. And it not only does it look different, but it kind of it breaks some of the things that I've mentioned to you before. But let's just look at how it works. Instead of while, I'm going to write a do. And the do is basically saying do this. And that while condition is going to be thrown at the end. Of course, let's not duplicate while. So it's going to be thrown at the end, kind of like this. And when I run it, you will see that it is at least going to run through the code once. And so when it runs through the code, it will then check the while condition and then loop back up. Now, because this while is being kept here kind of outside the brackets, it does need to end with a semicolon. You know, I sort of said with an if statement, it's making a decision. You don't need a semicolon. The while loop didn't need a semicolon there. The do loop, because it has a different structure, I need to put a semicolon at the end of the statement down here. So when would this be useful? Let's imagine that you want to keep getting input from a user. What you want, and let's say you want to keep getting input until the user types in -1 or Bob or whatever. You want to at least get one input in. And so using a do loop will ensure that I get at least one input in. So for example, if we just change this up, I could say score equals c.readInt. And so I know for sure now that I will get at least one score typed in. So let's try running this code. It's going to sit there waiting for me. Oh, I should at least be nice enough to prompt. So let's put something in here. c.println, enter a number. At least that's, let's, if we're going to do things, let's do them properly. So run, enter in a number. I'm going to enter in 5. It's going to ask me for another number, 2, another number, 6, another number, 0, and then the program ends. But at least I know that I have that one number being asked for. If instead I took this and turned it back into a while loop like this, I'm not guaranteed that it's going to at least get one. And so what you may have to do is you may have to add some extra code to make it behave in the same way. So for example, perhaps I have to copy this code and put it out in front of the while loop so that I know at least it's going to be getting one number before it checks. And that may not be as clean to some people as opposed to just changing it and using a do loop and knowing that it's going to go through that code at least once. What else do I have to say about while loops? Well, all the things that you learned about for loops also apply to while loops. And what I mean by that is that I can nest loops within loops. Yes, it starts to look complicated, but it can perfectly be done. I can also choose to break. So if you remember, that keyword break means that I'm going to be exiting the loop prematurely, early. Remember that break only exits the innermost loop, the one that you're in. So I might not have mentioned this in the last video, but if I had this inside here, for example, forget about the logic, I just made up the numbers. But when I break out of this, it's only going to break out of this inside loop. And so break will send me right down to this spot over here. It's not kind of breaking out of all loops. Sometimes you do want to break out of all loops, and that's a bit of a logic challenge that I'll leave with you as to how to make sure that you exit all those loops and come back out to the end. The other one we talked about was continue. So remember, what continue means is stop wherever you are inside this loop and just go back up to the top and do the check again. Okay. So those are some of the nuances with dealing with conditional loops. So guess what? It's time for you to give yourself an applause. Because once you've had a bit of practice, you have now mastered the 3 elements that Dijkstra said you have to know in order to kind of program, which is the idea of sequence, the idea of decision, and now the idea of repetition. And so with these tools, you already have the power to do a lot of things. So what else is there left to do in programming? Well, even though you have these tools available to you, it can still be very cumbersome in order to do certain things. We also want to be able to access things like files or databases or get access to the internet. We want to be able to make graphics and things like that. And so that's what I consider more intermediate programming topics. One of the most important intermediate topics would be the idea of lists. If you want to be able to read in 100 numbers, it kind of sucks right now because you need to have 100 variables to represent them. Once we talk about lists, you'll see that you can use one variable name to represent many different objects. And that is that will be really beneficial. I do want to leave you with a bit of a thought experiment. So we've talked about different kinds of loops. We've talked about counted loops, and we've talked about conditional loops. And even though many programming languages have this distinction, they are equivalent. So that means that it is possible for you to take a for loop and rewrite it as a while loop, or to take a while loop and rewrite it as a for loop. And so my thought experiment for you as I leave these beginning Java tutorials is for you to actually think about how to do that. Take a standard simple for loop that counts from 1 to 10. Think about how to turn that into a while loop, and vice versa. See if you can do the opposite. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed these video tutorials. I realize it's been a bit of a bumpy ride, but hopefully you've learned a little bit about how to program. And let's face it, not just a little bit. You can consider yourselves programmers now. Congratulations, and I'll see you in another set of videos soon.